You're watching a Decentered Media Talk with me, Rob Watson. Conversations about community media. Visit decentered.co.uk or follow on Instagram and Twitter at Decentered Media. Hello, it's Rob Watson here, and this is a Decentered Media Talk. And what I'm going to cover today in this session, this is the third talk, is an overview of community radio and kind of where it fits with different kinds of professional commercial radio, such as the BBC and the commercial networks. And what I want to do is just go through some kind of key issues. These are really pointers into ways in which we can look at some of the things that underpin if you like, the legislation for radio, and some of the things which are relevant in terms of what people say about radio and why radio is important. And then, in an addition to that, is to what is specific about community radio that makes it what it is, what defines it. So let's share the screen. The notes will be provided as a PDF, and that has all the links to any of the websites and documents that are referenced in this talk. And any comments or any observations about it, then please do get in contact with me either via email, robwatson@decentered.co.uk, or Twitter or Instagram at Decentered Media, or via the any of the online presence via decentered.co.uk. So kind of this is part of a series of looking at introducing ideas to community media, because I think it's, just to recap what we talked about in the previous two talks, it's important to note and to understand what the difference is in practice about community media, because it's often kind of marginalized and left out. It's seen, if you like, as a kind of a way of doing media for things that don't matter. But actually, it's more important than that, and perhaps it's more important than some of the ways that the mainstream received opinions about doing media are held. But that's we can discuss this. So we can think about how and in what way our media is relevant by looking at the idea of what the social importance of radio is overall. And it really is, it's not, radio has been around for 100 years or so, and the BBC is celebrating its 60th anniversary. So, its 100th anniversary next year. That's 2022. And so it's deeply embedded now certainly in Western Europe, the widespread availability of radio. And radio still retains something of a very kind of embedded characteristics. It's very trusted. And it's how do we understand radio? And on the one hand, it's become something which is highly commercialized. It kind of turned into a consumer product, which is produced and distributed with, overtly commercial aims. And on the other hand, it's also something which is an expression of our culture and our sense of identity. And, it raises issues about who we are, and as individuals and as groups and as a culture. So radio in some way embodies the life experiences that we have and that we share between one another, but more so in a way that kind of comes about because you just consume and manufactured goods. Is radio a passive medium then? I think that's a good question to think about. I think some forms of radio are turn the dial up on the listener as passive and just not participating. in the process of communication. But other forms of radio really do turn the dial up in terms of participation and engagement. And it's kind of, we probably go through different periods of our day and different periods of our lives where we are more intent to listen to, or more content to listen to, radio that is of a kind of companionship, if you like. Some people might describe it as wallpaper. It's on in the background, and there's good reasons that we listen to radio in that way. But also there might be more opportunity or more times when we listen to radio in a more active, engaged way. If you're a football fan, for example, and you're listening to the commentary of a particular football match, you're actively engaged in, and probably, if experiences, my experience is anything to go by, is that, kind of actively engaged in a conversation, or maybe a one-way conversation with the commentator about what and how they should be representing the flow of the game. So it's got this kind of very intimate radio approach, which gets into our lives, into our heads. We drive in our cars with radio on. We stand in our kitchens and do our domestic chores. We put headphones into our ears, and we listen. We go to bed listening to radios. Many of us wake up listening to radio, and it becomes this very kind of partnership with our daily routine. So from that point of view, wherever your taste and wherever your preference for different types of radio, it's incredibly important to recognize that it retains that kind of ability to embed itself in our lives. But in recent years, there's a kind of pushback against some of the corporatization and the marketization of radio, as well as other forms of media. Because if it's purely driven by market interests, and these market interests are primarily controlled by a small number of corporations, then how can we ensure that we get a widespread interaction with different ideas? And our media at the moment is going through a stage which is very polarizing and very antagonistic, and we see clickbait, and we see a lot of media which is designed to make us indignant, if you like, rather than actually to provide us with information. So who controls our media has an impact on the form of media that we end up getting. And it's, do we get the media that we deserve? If we don't ask questions, if we don't act as citizens in a public sphere, in a domain where we are taking social responsibility for what is happening in our communities, in our lives, in our society, then why would we expect our media to do anything other than just provide us with, the neuralgic forms of media, which just, the soporific, the media that just lulls us into a false sense of security and enables us to snooze through our lives, while at the same time, engaging with kind of stories that we kind of don't really have to question that much. But that's always a tension, and we should never underestimate that. But there are alternatives to that, and I think this is where maybe community media fits in a particular way to balance in that approach. So what we're going to look at is the kind of context in which community radio sits. So we've got what we well experienced, certainly here in the UK, with BBC and public service broadcast forms of media, where there is a clear intent to identify a set of values which are publicly agreed and negotiated by politicians, and which justify the payment of the BBC licence fee, which is effectively a tax. That's balanced with a commercial and independent style of broadcasting, where there's more freedom to make a profit, and there's more freedom to serve consumer needs, and to not have to provide content which is of social benefit or social relevance. It's purely what you take and are willing to pay for in the marketplace. But that's okay in a diversified network, in a situation where there's a broad spread ecology of different media corporations, companies, operators, all vying for your attention. But what we've seen in recent years is network consolidation, where fewer and fewer large-scale international corporations now own the majority of our radio networks. We'll balance this with looking at the community radio approach, which is based on the UNESCO model of radio about participation and access. And briefly, we'll look at the foundation stones, if you like, of community radio, which is the access radio approach, but also consider this in terms of the technological shift that's happening and taking place as we deal with the rapid rise of digital technologies, network technologies, the internet, and so on. So the BBC is our here in the UK is our primary public service broadcaster, and it's supported through legislation, an act of parliament to provide a particular set of services, and these are negotiated with the government through a charter, which is addressed about every 10 years now, and these are funded through the public license fee. There's some discussion about that at the moment because the ability of the BBC to keep up with Netflix and Amazon and Disney, those kind of international providers of media content, because the license fee has been fixed to a certain value, and as inflation increases and costs of media producing media increase, and also the range of services that the BBC is expected to provide increases, then there's a lot more pressure on what that money is spent on. But fundamentally, the BBC sets out 5 public purposes: to provide impartial news and information to people and help people understand and engage in the world around them. We might have a debate and discussion about the nature of the word impartial as opposed to objective. Impartial suggests one side versus another side, whereas objective suggests some independent verification of the merits of a news story. So that is quite contentious, and we see that being played out in our political debates and discussions, almost on a daily basis. Secondly, to support learning for people of all ages. What form that learning comes in and what model of learning and how that operates and works is not defined, and it's up to the BBC to use its skills to inform and educate people as well as entertain people in that famous Reithian model of what the BBC is founded to do, to show a creative quality and distinctiveness to the output and services of the BBC so that they are relevant and relate to different parts of the audience, and that young people are served, older people are served, and that nobody is overserved. The tension at the moment is that the terrestrial broadcasters are predominantly watched by older people, 50 plus, and the danger is that there's an over-servicing of those people because they watch the traditional legacy forms of media, broadcast radio, broadcast television, and what they're not doing is engaging with online media, and the BBC is therefore potentially not engaging with younger audiences. So they've got to show some engagement in some way to address the needs of different groups of people and regionally as well. So the fourth point is to reflect and represent and serve the diverse communities of all of the United Kingdom nations and regions. And at the same time, support the creative economy that is now, quite significant and quite substantial here in the UK. And then overall to reflect the UK's values and culture to the rest of the world. So it's got that intra-community nation set of mission of values and purposes, and it's got that extra, appealing, reflecting that to the people in other parts of the world. and the BBC World Service does those kind of tasks on the BBC's behalf, but also through things like commercial partnerships and the new platform for BritBox, that kind of thing, of being able to, provide channels, BBC News channels and services that go out in different ways through different systems and platforms around the world. It's not as easy as providing 3 channels anymore. To put this in a context, Ofcom, the National Register, Ofcom is the national regulator, that's what I was trying to say, of media services and information services in the UK. And the BBC was brought into Ofcom's remit so that there is oversight of what the BBC, so the BBC isn't entirely regulating itself. It used to do that. Now it has it has to answer to Ofcom and produce reports which are managed through the last remaining Quango, which is non-governmental organisation, which provides oversight for broadcasting and media services in the UK. And Ofcom have been conducting a review, asking questions about how and in what way public service media in general, and that shift from calling it public service broadcasting to public service media is quite important to note. But Ofcom are talking about how that is going to go forward in the future. Is it purely the role of the BBC to be subsidised to provide public service content, or should other organisations receive money through the public purse or through the license fee payers, the license fee, in order to pay for content that has a clear public service benefit, which might not otherwise get produced within the commercial realm? And we see this with something like the Audio Content Fund that provides funding for programming of a public service nature that doesn't normally get carried by some of the commercial radio networks, for example. And does this need new legislation? In what way do we strengthen the remit? Because I think there is a clear support for public service media regulation in the UK. When we do shy away from going down the route of the Americanized route of just a kind of commercial free for all, but do Ofcom do this proficiently, sufficiently? Is the public regulation and the provision of public service media sustainable given the amount of technical change and the drift into alternative platforms? So there's lots of important questions about whether the organisations like the BBC and Channel 4 are fit for the future. And there's a discussion at the moment about privatising Channel 4, or the proposal to privatise Channel 4. This is not all taken at face value. There are campaigns that push back against the way that the media is regulated here in the UK. And so the Media Reform Coalition and organisations like Better Media are active campaigners for reform, and to look at how we can reconfigure the media to be something which is closer to people's needs. And I mean, one of the big complaints at the moment is that media producers are distant from communities and different regions and nations. I mean, just that phrase, regions and nations. I wish we could come up with another phrase, because it kind of has a very kind of top-down kind of management approach from London, deciding what goes on in the far reaches of the regions. There are alternative ways, and the Media Reform Coalition's suggestion for a media commons is worth looking at as an alternative in their BBC and Beyond campaign. So, I mean, there's also the kind of free market approach, which says that we should really just sell off the BBC and just kind of strip it down to a bare minimum information provision service in the same way that, if you like, the public service model is in the United States, where the market can provide solutions and people will pay for what it is that provides them with the best content that they value for themselves. So the characteristics of what makes radio then still a valuable tool is really to do with a number of factors which the Radio Centre has identified, which are a good illustration of what is built into radio, if you like, after that 100-year history. What is built into radio as a way of giving it a legitimacy in either for marketing and mass communications. Radio has been very effective through the pandemic. The model of communication that radio potentially offers, although not 100% valid, is largely valid on the basis that it is still a very effective medium. And according to the Radio Centre, and this is market research, which justifies itself, justifying a way, market research always is likely to be uncritical to some extent, because it wants to deliver a product to potential advertisers. But I think generally some of these things are absolutely correct. So that the issues that radio can deal with, which provide a strong relationship with listeners, things like frequency of content is very high. The level of emotional response that you can get through from radio is very high. The low cost of radio and the low production requirements of radio make it a quick turnover. You can have quite a lot of radio, and compared to television, it's many times less the cost. It can also provide a safe environment, and it can be measured. So there are the RAJAR audience figures which validate, and the advertising figures which validate the effectiveness of radio. As compared to other forms of media, social media is less clear about the way that it builds relationships with with audiences, because there's it's a bit more confusing. But if you get people to radio, they generally trust and appreciate the content that is being played and being discussed and articulated through the programming. The key players in the UK radio sector are predominantly Global and Bauer. They probably have about 70 or 80% of the network ownership, and they dominate the format-based commercial style radio. And there's very few independent radio stations or networks that you could go and trade. You could buy a station. D Radio Group is one small network. Nation Broadcasting again have a small network. Premier, specialist network around Christian programming. But by and large, most of our radio commercial radio is controlled by international conglomerates, which makes it, to some extent, you kind of ending up with a homogenization of content, where everything starts to sound very similar and copies itself, and nothing really breaks out of that. It becomes very difficult to justify the investment. So in order to produce quite esoteric and iconoclastic and distinctive programming, that requires quite a significant producer-focused investment. And a lot of the time, radios run on the basis of trying to strip away as much of the costs as possible. So you stick with the routines and the short-term play out, the greatest hits. If you listen to classic FM, it's the joke is that it's Vivaldi's Four Seasons on a loop, and maybe the same for Capital FM. It's Justin Bieber on loop, or used to be. So it's run in a way which is designed for very specific style of listening, which is short term rather than long engaged periods of listening, and it's something that people dip in and out of, maybe as they get in the car and drive to a supermarket, but they're not kind of tuning in to a play or tuning into a discussion or a documentary, which is what BBC Radio 4, BBC Radio 3 tends to do. There are things like the football and sports channels and the 5 Live and the Talk Sport. They have a different kind of relationship, which is primarily based around capturing the audience for sports fans. But put it in the context, if you like, of platforms, and every time there's a new platform introduced, then it changes the way that we think about what the potential is of communications. So as radio transformed through the 20th century and devices became smaller and more portable, and in the 1920s and 30s, maybe up to the 1940s, radio sets were something that you'd listen to as a family in the living room. And then in the 1950s and 60s, there was the rise of the transistor radio, and that tied in with the rise of the teenager being able to listen to, in the 60s, particularly to stations like Radio Caroline and the pirate stations, because radio sets were smaller, used less power, and could be carried around. And that kind of but entertainment, I mean, in the UK, it wasn't really until the 1960s, the late 1960s, that television's dominance was really cemented. A lot of radio programs still had significant listeners, and the BBC. It's reported that the BBC cancelled popular radio shows like Round the Horn because they were too popular. And that people were maybe moving over on buying televisions, and the money that was going into television was, it wasn't being appreciated, should we say, by the audience, because they were happy to some extent with what they'd got through the established radio format. So there's always this kind of push and pull as a new technology comes in. It generates a new sense of engagement with audiences, and we always have to be mindful how these platforms work. And in the 1980s, we had the rise of satellite broadcasting and cable broadcasting here in the UK, and now we've got IP-based, internet-based media, where basically any kind of scarcity for media engagement has gone. You've just got an unlimited amount of access to different media content as long as you can pay for it through the internet, and you can subscribe to many different channels and applications and platforms as you wish, and get content from around the world. It doesn't have to be your local radio station anymore. You can listen to programming from wherever you choose to find it. So this is all something which is considered to some extent by the recent DCMS, that's the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport department in government, which looked at the potential role for digital radio and audio in the future. A couple of questions about this model. It was primarily driven by if you read the report, it's primarily driven by the needs of radio set manufacturers for cars, and the focus was on digital, but it did raise some important questions about the rise of things like smart speakers and the proliferation of, and we'll look at some numbers in a second, the proliferation of alternative methods for listening to what we call radio content, either through a smartphone, through a tablet, through a computer, or through a smart speaker, and how that's impacting on the sale and relevance of radio sets in their traditional mode. But through this, the government recognises that radio is still the trusted medium for news, and it's still an essential source for company, more so than television as well, because you can get on and do other things. That's the good thing about radio, is that you can walk along the street, you can drive, and you can do the dishes, not at the same time, but you can do those things separately as you listen to radio. And there's a lot has come through with the pandemic, that the numbers of people tuning into radio as they're working from home has increased, because it's difficult to work and concentrate while you're looking at a screen and watching a video or something. Whereas when you've got music or conversation on in the background, you can maybe do different types of work that are, it's got that accessibility still. And so it's not going to go away. What we term of radio-ness is not going to disappear. It's still going to be an important and essential feature of our media ecology. And the number of the proportion of people listening via AM radios has now been surpassed by the number of people who are listening on DAB digital radios. And there are other forms of digital radio out there internationally. And not all countries are using the big countries like Brazil and China haven't adopted digital audio broadcasting. They're still working with FM and AM and seem to be doing fine with that. But also things like listening through smartphones, speakers, laptops, and other devices. If you'd have gone back 10 years, this would have almost been entirely dominated by AM and FM, whereas now it's a much more of a mixed model, and radio stations are having to get their content out using different platforms, whether it's Facebook live stream, YouTube live stream, whether it's things like TuneIn, so that people can listen, whether it's things like podcasts and that people can download things. Then there's a whole range of other ways that people can engage with and get to audio content that people are producing. And by age, this varies to some extent, that the proportions of adult listeners are, and in this graph, it's described as 15 and above, and you can see the light blue area is the DAB digital radio listening, which is above 55 plus is 41%, but 15 to 24s is 22%, and almost a direct reversal of the smartphone listening is 38% in the 15 to 24s and only 5% in the 55 plus. So it's the generational change is going to feed through, and as people become more familiar with using portable smart devices in whatever form that takes, then that's how they'll access radio content. But there's no guarantee that the young consumers of radio at the 15 to 24 age will go to the traditional broadcasters that the 55 plus age group go to. It could be something entirely different, probably based around brands, maybe based around games, maybe based around artificial reality applications. So many different ways that that content will become available and relevant to people in the future. But it doesn't mean to say that you should throw away just because there's only 11% of 15 to 24-year-olds listen to AM and FM radio, doesn't mean to say that you should stop supporting AM and FM radio, because as was really, I thought was a really great statement, is that AM is the new vinyl, and that legacy medias have their value, and they're low cost and they're accessible, and we need to maintain and ensure that not everything is pushed into the digital realm, because not everything in our lives, not everybody wants to, we're never going to turn around and say that all books should be digital. We still print books, and in fact, there's been a resurgence of printed books. So with the right levels of investment and understanding of what it is that people want, we may see a resurgence in the younger age groups as to listening to more legacy-based traditional forms of radio broadcasting. The way that radio plays a role in people's lives, though, is there's a high level of engagement. Is that radio has this ability to kind of plug in with both our functional and our emotional needs, and that 90% of people, this is according to the DCMS report, were able to say that radio keeps them in touch with the world. And keeps people informed. And that's incredibly high numbers from the people that were surveyed. That sense of connection, engagement with the world, and that, less so in terms of trusted news. So there's work to be done around that. But the other factors of company, mood, and happiness, the kind of general sense of well-being that people get from radio is still very high. People aren't coming away from radio feeling entirely depressed, not yet. So there's still a resonance within people's lives of what radio offers at an emotional level, rather than just thinking of it purely as, if you thought of radio just as an information mechanism, then you're missing out on a whole set of things, comedy, your identity, you're missing out on, kind of fashion, so many things that you can add with radio that maybe can't be delivered in other mediums, because it's got this kind of a couple of factors, which we'll talk about in a minute, which give it its essential characteristics. How many people listen to radio at least once a week? Well, again, that's quite high. Less in terms of listening every day. So more people listen across a week, and it generally there's a consistency higher for white respondents than it is for people from different ethnic minority backgrounds. But across the week, there is a consistency there in the 70%. And similarly, listening to radio every day, there's a slight 10% increase for white respondents to listen to radio every day, as opposed to people from other ethnic minority backgrounds to listen to radio every day. But again, very consistent over time as well. So radio retained a significant level of routine in people's lives, that once established listening to radio, people don't easily drop out of the habit of listening to radio. And once it's embedded and people recognize and value what radio offers in its different forms, then people stick with it. And overall, the kind of share, so between the type of content, so a primary focus is on live radio, and radio retains a sense of liveness. Might be broadly, what we mean by live is open to question, because there's a lot of things that are tricks and practices that are done in radio production, radio program making, which makes it feel as if it is live. So what do we mean by live radio? Do we mean something like news reports and commentary, or do we mean voice tracking? And we'll talk about what voice tracking is shortly. Voice tracking, which can be pre-recorded and makes it feel like it's live, but it isn't actually live, it's done in advance. But as opposed to things like listening again, the BBC iPlayer, going back to programs and listening to a program in its entirety, it's quite small. Listening to digital tracks, audio books, and we see the way that these have changed over time. Podcasts is growing, but still overall a small proportion of the market. Although you've got to ask the question about the value of each of these components. So audiobooks and podcasts, for example, or if they're successful, if they engage with people, are of high value. And that has a knock-on effect for niche radio stations. So, for example, Times Radio launched recently, and its conversations and discussions about UK news and politics could potentially be impacted by a successful YouTube or podcast channel or program, because you're kind of competing for people's attention in an area where people are, say, are well informed in those areas. The same with some entertainment issues. So this I think will change more over in the next 5 years as well. It'll be interesting to track that. So the kind of online platforms that you've got, you can stream through various applications on most smartphones or even on televisions now. My television has BBC Sounds, which I can stream through, and I think it's got TuneIn, so I can stream through my TV. And they also through things like smart speakers, so the Amazon Echo and the Google Echo and the Amazon, can never remember which one it is, but the Google devices are now offering a more seamless way of listening to different stations and using voice command. And this has really been the growth area for listening to radio and radio style content, podcasts and audiobooks in the last couple of years, because it's the tech giants of really making this interoperable and are making this accessible, and the skills, the kind of skills that are associated with things like the Amazon Echo are much more. They're being updated all the time, so people can accents and you don't have to use, you don't have to look at a screen. You don't have to use your fingers to navigate anything. It's very accessible as a digital format. We may see, a greater increase in digital capability for people who are a bit shy of digital engagement, finding alternative platforms through things like smart speakers. So again, that's kind of comes through in the DCMS report as being one of the key areas of growth and development, and that smart speakers outsell the sales of DAB radios quite significantly now. So let's have a watch of a short video which describes how one radio station based in Nottingham was supported by a local water services company to get on air when they had a problem with their broadcasts.
Radio Warrington was launched by two friends in March 2007, but its broadcasts have been restricted to just the internet for most of the time it's been on air. The station now has grown to more than 30 volunteers, with programmes being transmitted around the clock, despite only being available via a web browser, smartphone or tablet. Permission was secured for several successful temporary broadcasts over the years, which bosses say proves there was an appetite for a permanent service covering the town. Now Radio Warrington has been granted a licence for AM, medium wave broadcasts.
To be able to communicate successfully with our audience, the internet is obviously a way of doing it. We're able to talk to people around the world who are ex-Warrington people, but this will allow us to talk to people in real time, in their cars, in their homes, in their workplace, etc. The radio, although the internet might be the future, it's not the present, it's not the now. So we're very keen to get on the proper airwaves and be able to talk to people, giving them important information and news about the town.
Despite getting a licence, there was a problem: where to build the transmitter. Searches for a suitable site were fruitless, and even the local council couldn't help. But thanks to a chance meeting with a member of staff from United Utilities, a home for the equipment and aerials has been found at a water treatment works. United Utilities has even offered the use of an old building for the transmitter and is putting in an electricity supply to power it.
United Utilities came up with an absolutely spot-on location. We would have been in real trouble had this not happened. It was almost like it was fate, really, that this all came about. We really didn't have any plan B. So United Utilities have been absolutely spot on with what they've given us.
Radio Warrington hopes to switch on its new AM programmes in the next few months.
So it's maybe a little bit dated now. Things move very quickly. 5 years has been a long time in terms of the provision of digital services. and we may have seen some shifts in terms of expectations about, is it easier? A lot of stations now can meet their demand by just being online. And stations like Melodic Distraction in Liverpool has no intention of being on a broadcast transmitter. It's very, it's worked out how to engage with its audience in online. And it seems to be, very proficient at doing that. So around the country, there's quite a few online radio stations, which is something we'll talk about in a future talk coming, in a few sessions time. So one of the things that kind of characterizes what we understand by radio is that it's largely format driven, and radio doesn't have to be format driven, but it tends to be. And that there are certain characteristics as to what define format radio. So things like having a fixed schedule, using playout systems, having particular styles of promotion and advertising, jingles, that kind of thing. That there's often a sense of liveness to it, and that it incorporates music, a high level of music, with some degree of news, whether that's informal or formal news bulletins. But the majority of what we expect from our radio is format driven, although not all radio stations are format driven. And if you are ever in Devon and are up on the Dartmoor Hills, tune into, I can't remember the frequency, but tune into Skylark Radio, which doesn't use a traditional format. It uses sounds from the environment and stories and recordings, which are played out through a kind of looping playout system. So that eschews, moves away from the kind of standard model of a format radio station based around things what they call clocks. But the radio formats and tend to be thinking about radio in this way is a very American way of thinking about radio. So the kind of top 40 stations, dance and urban radio stations, oldies, classical radio stations, world radio stations. The Americans seem to be more at ease with this. Here in the UK, we've not really focused on one because we just don't have the numbers. 350 radio stations is perhaps not enough when you compare it to the amount of the number of radio stations in the United States. If it's tenfold increase, then you can organize things around these kind of genres a bit more. But sometimes as well, I think the genres can maybe be a bit restricted, although they do signal to the audience what type of content it is that you're going to be getting, and it certainly helps for internet searches. And we've become used to using tags and categories for searching for content online. So when we look for something, it tells us what it's grouped around, and inevitably you get the recommendations. Well, you liked this, so therefore you'll like this. And if you've got Spotify or Apple Music, it does a lot of that. And interestingly, Spotify and Apple Music also incorporate radio programming within their streaming menus and repertoires. So, but most radio stations follow a schedule, and if you want to, you can look at the Radio Times for a listing of what is presently on. You might also go to, if you're on a TV, you might look at the electronic program guide. Traditionally, this would have been printed in a newspaper. I'm not sure whether that still happens. And I remember, actually, I do remember, reading the newspaper, and one of the first things you turn to is what's on the TV guide, what's on the TV that evening. It shows you how long it is since I've actually picked up a newspaper. I've then also wanted to pick up a guide as to what's being broadcast that evening, because I'm so used to on-demand programming. But most radio stations, for ease of production capability and planning, and just who's going to be in the studio at a particular time, will use a grid-like structure where a program is broken down, a day, if you like, is broken down into hour segments, and that you can have a particular group of people come in and do, say, 2 hours or an hour or whatever it is that you choose as the relevant way to organize your station. So it's done in blocks. And a lot of the systems, pretty much all of the systems that govern or support radio playout is based around these kind of systems. So it gives it a very kind of well-structured way of knowing where the live elements are, where the pre-recorded elements are, where the connections with other network-based programming might be, and then also what glues all of this together in terms of an active schedule. So most, and there's a lot of these out there now, which again, over the last 10 years or so have become common to be able to get free versions that you can download from the internet, or you can pay to use different systems, which are playout systems, which do the organizing for you, which shape and structure. You input a lot of tracks or documentaries and your jingles and your program idents, and you create a structure, and then you can either let this run automatically, or you can interact with it live, and that you can, the program playout system does a lot of the work for you. Again, there's no compelling reason for using an automated system. Many stations, particularly commercial stations, fix their playout system in a tight pattern, so that DJs have, say, 15 seconds to do an introduction here, 25 seconds to do a link there, because that fits in with the market research that they've done about the listenership engagement models. Whereas other stations might kind of say, well, look, it doesn't matter. I mean, Radio 3, for example, doesn't play the news out exactly at 7 a.m. in the morning. If there's a song that's being played and it carries on over till 2 minutes past 7, then that's fine for something like Radio 3. Not all radio stations are bound by those kind of strict deadlines of automation. One of the tricks that you can use with the automation playout systems, though, is pre-record your links and make them sound very professional and proficient. So, they kind of start at just exactly the right moment, and the music introduction comes in on the radio edit for the song that's being played out, and the DJ speaks just before they hit this marker where the singer comes in. Well, that used to be something that the DJ used to have to practice. Now you do it through automation by doing voice tracking, and that you can drop in elements of voice tracking, and you can construct a program very, very quickly. You can have the prearranged elements inserted in advance, and you can just drop in it's drag and drop stuff now, and what would take an hour can take you 30 minutes to organize a whole program now, because you've recorded those elements, and it kind of takes the pressure off you. Maybe it takes away some of the spontaneity and the relationship building that goes with a live broadcast. Gluing all of this together is the kind of ubiquitous promos and jingles, which are really there to give a station some identity and to let you know what the station's about. It gives it a certain kind of feel. It says here, kind of this is taken from the listing on this station package site that I found. And it says that it's kind of almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, because it gives a professional feel. Well, it depends what you mean by professional. And if we listen for a moment to some, we'll maybe have a discussion about what that means, what that feel means in practice.
You're locked to Phuket Vibe. Just because your workday might be boring doesn't mean your radio station has to be.
Finally, Phuket Vibe. A radio station the whole family can enjoy. Playing music you like to hear. Well, at least some of you.
Contrary to popular belief, length does matter.
And it goes on. I mean, for me, this is just overproduced. It sounds very overly punchy, overly compressed. All of the same, exactly the same sounds that you get on a large number of stations. There's no variety, the same tone of voice, all of those stabs and stings and whooshes and things like that. I just, it's become a very, the idea of radio radio identity, if you like, as narrowed, and I'd like to see, some. I mean, it's the good thing that we've got with community media. You don't have community radio. You don't have to follow these patterns. You can create your own. You can create your own jingles, and there's lots of examples out there of people who've made creative jingles which are completely the opposite to what we've just heard. Okay, somebody's got an expensive audio editing package and they love playing with all the toys. That doesn't mean to say that, because I find if it's just consistently at that kind of level, my ears get tired very, very quickly because there's no dynamic range. And maybe that's intentional for some radio stations to want you to only listen to 15 or 20 minutes, whereas other radio stations might say, look, you're going to be with us for 2 or 3 hours. Don't exhaust your listeners by over compressing.
You're locked to Phuket.
Let's get away from that. So the kind of station sounds and what they call imaging ranges from jingles, what they call sweepers, they're kind of spoken announcements. You get jingles that are without spoken jingles, a cappellas, music beds so that the DJ can talk, the presenter can talk, liners, so a quick announcement of the station's name, and drop-ins, drones, prolonged sound effects, kind of, on the quiz, when somebody calls in for a quiz and you're building up the tension, those kind of stuff. We hear this all the time. And it's kind of, using listener voices to phone in to say, hey, your show's great, and all that kind of stuff. A kind of standard repertoire. And I think there's, it's very... it's in the last few, 10 years or so, it's become much more, much narrower and less imaginative in terms of the sweep and the range and variety and the creativity that, many radio stations, commercial radio stations, just sound the same because they're using all the same kind of tools. They're using the same software. They listen to each other's work and they copy and imitate each other. And I'm not sure that's the best way to get to an audience, and that we want to increase some diversity with that. So then the other major factor that radio is associated with is a sense of liveness. And as we saw in the figures that were shown earlier, that there's still a strong a chord for people listening to radio because it is live. And there's this kind of immediate reach that we cover an event, whether it's a sports event, a news event, that it gives us some sense, or whether it's phone-ins, there's a sense that you're engaging with people as it happens. And the liveness it draws you in as part of a witness to the event, a witness to what's been. And it's very difficult. I take my hat off to people who are able to enunciate and elaborate what they're thinking and what they're seeing and observing and putting it into a form of words, which goes beyond merely just saying, football wise, there's a man running after a ball on a field. There's 24 men running after a ball on a field. Would be about the limit of my ability to describe that, but it can almost become poetic. So it's this very, to paint those pictures. And that's one of the famous ideas about radio, is that it paints pictures in our heads, and we have to use our imagination as one of those things that embed radio as part of its value. So being able to do that and follow that in a live way as well, with and relay the sounds that come through. I think sometimes a lot of radio is unnecessarily studio bound, and one of the things that we witnessed over the pandemic was that a lot of radio presenters had to work from home, so they were setting up home studios, and they were apologizing. No, there's a dog barking in the background, or the birds are in the background, or my children are running around the house in the background. It's like, I love that. I think that's great. Sterile studios are there largely for the professionals, not for the listeners, and it adds an extra dimension of liveness to have that added dimension of sound that or events that go with it. So, liveness is still incredibly important. If there's breaking news, you tend to turn on, on the radio, even more so sometimes than TV news. It can give you a sense of immediacy, and because the production process is slightly less layered than television news, where you've got to get a camera somewhere, then it's effectively a lot of what goes for 24-hour television news is in fact radio. They've just try and put some pictures on the front of it, and often the pictures are just repeated ad nauseum, whereas radio, you do that in a very different way. Of course, music is massively important for radio and an integral part of radio. And almost defines who we are in a way. And I have fond memories of listening to BBC Radio 1 in the 1980s, and sitting in fields with friends and listening to Steve Wright in the afternoon. So you kind of retain this. People, will have the same with different presenters of different generations, and you've reached a certain age when you turn the radio on and you can't stand any of the music. So I have this problem when I go to the gym that that I don't like any of the music that's being played on the radio that's piped into the gym and the changing rooms. It's not for me. But other, the younger generation who are there, they all know these songs and I don't know them. I've never heard of them, and that's really important because that's kind of in a way how we form part of the way that we form our social identities and develop a sense of social cohesion around music. Music has that identification with that music, has a really strong way of bringing us together, and it kind of confirms who we are and when we were doing certain things, and it helps us to remember that we're part of a wider social network of people who have similar interests in particular kinds of music, whether it's hip hop, whether it's reggae, whether it's rave, whatever that is. There's always, it's like a postcard. When you listen back to it 20 years later, you're kind of listening back to a postcard from your earlier life, and that's incredibly important and powerful. And radio has that effect for us, both to discover music and to become aware of somebody. So one of the roles of the DJ, the music DJ, is to guide us and curate music for us so that we get a sense that there's something else out there that we want to be attuned to, and that there are other people like ourselves who are listening to similar kinds of music. The radio had the advantage of kind of homogenizing that a bit and kind of bringing people together in large numbers, which has been fragmented with the rise of the online platforms and the streaming platforms, but not entirely. And people imitate, and it's interesting that the streaming platforms imitate radio still, because they recognize that what radio did and what radio does is still incredibly important as a cultural means of understanding a form of cultural identity, which is based around music. So, as we indicated earlier, trusted news is perhaps the other major factor, and the European Broadcast Union did some research recently, which talks about which forms of broadcast media are the most trusted, and with kind of social networks being the least trusted, newspapers slightly on the negative side of trustworthiness, television news slightly on the positive, but radio clearly trusted as a source, because you kind of have to strip away the sensation in a way to describe something. Not entirely. There's some radio news formats which I disagree with the use of the word cops in a news report. I think it should always be police. But when you relate in the story and the cops were called, it sounds a bit sensationalist to me. And it's that kind of thing where the use of language is incredibly important. Who is your audience is going to be an important factor. But with radio, you can't just show gratuitous pictures. You can't just show, kind of rely on the pictures to tell their own story. You have to paint that picture, and you have to use words to describe that. So that's at the same time more difficult, but the extra effort and the skill that it takes to present news in a way which is fair and unbiased is incredibly important, because it brings out something which radio news can be more informing in that way. And I think that's probably why it's trusted so much. What's this documentary?
You're You're listening to WCR Community Radio, keeping you in touch on 105.5 FM stereo, serving Warminster and the surrounding area. This is WCR.
WCR.
8 o'clock to take over from Mike. Mike's warmed up the other studio, all ready to bring you lots of great music. I don't know if he's going to tell us what he's got. Does he know? Oh, here he is. Look, he's running in now. Yeah, he's got his little list.
Yep, jumped over the hurdles, over the people that are on the floor.
Knocked him out with the microphone as well.
Yeah, he got knocked over.
So what's he got lined up for us tonight?
Alright, tonight I've got Ollie Mears, I've got Madness, I've got Nerd Skinner, I've got Extreme, The Police, Britney Spears, Ed Sheeran.
He said that with enthusiasm, didn't he?
I know, it's because I've not played a Britney Spears song ever.
Okay,
really? She had a good one not long ago.
I don't know. I can't remember what her last one was.
Clint's still got One More Time somewhere.
Probably.
Sorry,
he plays it in the car on the way.
He does quite often.
No, it's Spaceship.
Oh yeah.
George Ezra. I've got Take That, but I've got Back for Good by Take That. So it's from the 90s instead of the last few years.
They've got a new one out now, haven't they? Which, is that with 3 of them? Don't tell me which one's missing because I haven't had a chance to find
They're falling like
Jason
flies.
Orange or something like that.
Oh, Jason Orange.
They're falling like flies, aren't
they?
I
know.
Yeah, he's the one he's probably the lead vocal in the I can't remember what the name. I think the Morrison's advert.
Oh well, he's made it big now. And Clint's still looking for Robbie.
I am, yeah. Robbie apparently still lives in this country, in Wiltshire somewhere.
Yes, I think he does actually.
But he spends a lot of time in the Nevada desert looking for UFOs.
Oh well, we'll see him there then.
But if you...
So, the first thing that grabs me is the informality of it, the lack of professionalism. The guy sat down, isn't on the microphone. The accents are local to Warminster. The references that they're talking about. There's also a kind of, a sense of a lack. If I said a lack of care, I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in a way which says that you don't need the routines, the slickness in order to be a good companion, to be relevant to your local listeners. There are other factors that we can explore that make radio engaging, which don't have to just, if you like, regurgitate what we hear through the large-scale commercial networks, because they're very good at doing what they're doing. But when it comes to a couple of people volunteering on a Sunday evening or something to do some programs, you're going to approach it in a very different light. And it brings us onto those values, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail, is, the principles of non-professionalism, of being local, of being relevant, and that it's self-governed. And what you're doing with community radio is you're pushing back against the kind of vertical, the top-down types of communication that most of our media is focused on, and becomes something which is a lot more flatter, horizontal between your listeners and your presenters. And indeed, what you ideally want is people to sit at home and go, hang on a minute, I'd like to do a radio program, and they can access and come into the radio station and do their own program with a little bit of training and a little bit of help. But the things that they're talking about are relevant, and that it's focused on an idea of social change and local relevance, rather than it being something which is just there to, like a hamster on a treadwheel, just going round and round and round in the same circle, repeating the same things all the time. So the advantage of this kind of decentralized approach is that it opens up the potential for diversity and creativity, and it creates room for different types of content and different forms of radio to be experimented with. So they're the kind of main principles that community radio supports. Formally, though, and this is the UNESCO model of community radio, and these are, I think, are the core foundational values, which are now commonly accepted pretty much everywhere in the world, is that it has a recognized community at its heart, and that it's not a generic audience, it's not a generic sense of the community, that phrase that we use and hear a lot, who are you doing this for? The community. Well, who is that community? Who are those people? Is a very important question for us to ask whenever we're thinking of doing community style radio. And the focus has to be on encouraging a sense of participatory democracy, encouraging people and giving people the opportunity to engage in communication, conversation in terms of the program making itself, in terms of the management and the ownership of the station itself, and that you're using technology in a way which is relevant to the economic capability of the people who are getting involved. So what you're not doing is putting the bar so high that you must have so many, a certain type of playout system or a certain type of mixing desk or a certain type of studio or certain types of microphones that just exclude people because they're unrealistically expensive. So the motives that you're looking for with community radio is that they are driven by a sense of community well-being and not commercial considerations, and that they, by their very nature, if you like, promote and improve problem solving and social cohesion within those communities on the basis of solving those problems, about getting involved. If you want to find out more about some of the work that is done in community radio, I would highly recommend the Community Radio Awards, which is communityradiooawards.org.uk. And there's a lot of examples on their website of stations and programming makers who have produced content which is of a very high standard and distinctive for radio. I mean, there's a broad church. There will be stuff on there which is imitative of professionalized radio, but there's definitely lots of things in there which are very specific and identifiable as community radio, and based on things like the level of participation, the level of access, the level of training, the type of locality that's being represented, and this idea of self-governance. And it's to give voice to those without voices is the very well established mantra, I suppose, of community radio. So the practices that we'd expect from community radio then, as opposed to public service, professional, commercial media, are going to be different. And we're going to have to think about how this is done and each experience of each station and each platform and each project is going to be different. They're never the same. So we've got to really think about different ways that we can support people and inspire people, I think, empower people to bring their voice. And that might not mean structuring our programs around the standard interview program, for example, but there might be different ways of going for a walk or using object-based learning. And we have to consider how do we diversify the supply of content? One, we want to diversify the supply in the first place because we recognize that not everybody is served by the mainstream model of broadcasting. And we've learnt this through the pandemic, and we've certainly learnt this through our experience here in Leicester, that communications have been very narrow and focused on a particular kind of process which is related to a very narrow sense of demographic identification, which has excluded lots of people and overlooked lots of people. So one of the primary factors for community radio and community media practices is thinking about who's not in the room. How do we get those people who are always easily overlooked to be included? That should be, if you like, the first question that we ask is who's not being included in the programming that we make. And if it is a bunch of white middle-aged men playing records all the time, then we really need to think about how and why that is and what we can do to change that. So the relevance to where we are and our community of interest, whether that's identity or faith or cultural interest, is paramount in that, because there's lots of underserved and underutilized expertise out there which we're not tapping into. Coupled with a strong sense of accountability and self-governance and self-management. And we'll look at those issues in more detail in future talks. Let's have another quick look at video. This one from UNICEF.
आमर गोष्ठी रेडियो स्टेशन रे देसिया भाषा ही बाजी थाए जो परिवर्तन हमें नहीं है तो वो परिवर्तन हम ले आए हैं
गाँव मन को जाउछि लोक मन संग मिसुछि और से गाँव मध्ये देखि पारे
संस्कृति रो गीत नाट्य जहाँ लोप पाई जाउछि ताहा को बंचाई रखिया पई आमे एहा करि
The inhabitants of Barkheda village in Lalitpur are waking up to a new dawn. A dawn that ushers in airwaves of social change. Empowering communities at the grassroots level is Uttar Pradesh's very first community radio station. For community reporters, months of training and perseverance have finally come to fruition with the much-awaited launch of their very own community radio station.
It's quite difficult to create awareness about different schemes, programs, and rights of the citizens through written campaigns. So radio becomes a very important medium.
हमारे यहाँ कोई अगर घटना होती है तो हम अपनी लोकवाणी पर रिपोर्ट कर सकते हैं.
Lalitpur is one of the 7.
All the links for these videos are in the talk notes, which will be up with the on the website. I think many of the lessons when we look at things from the UNICEF and UNESCO model of community radio, we really can learn lots of lessons about how community radio might be here in the UK. The framework that sets up radio in the UK is governed by a number of acts of parliament: the Broadcasting Act 1990, the Broadcasting Act 1996, the Communications Act 2003, the Community Radio Order of 2004, and then the Small Scale Radio Multiplex and Community Digital Radio Order of 2019. And all of these shape and identify the legal obligations of broadcasters here in the UK and the duties of Ofcom, the broadcast regulator. And Ofcom's primary duty is to further the interest of citizens in relation to community matters, communications matters, and to further the interest of consumers. And it does this by ensuring that there is access, efficient access to wireless telegraphy in the electromagnetic spectrum. That's the broad sense in terms of information and data is carried. I mean, this is going to be brought up to date more with information communications, IP-based, internet-based protocols in the future, because that will determine some change. But Ofcom is provided with the requirement that it has to serve and ensure that there's a sufficient plurality of providers who enable a wide range of television and radio services. They do this in part by ensuring that anybody who's licensed as a broadcaster or as a media supplier, again, this doesn't yet apply to the online platforms, have to conform to the broadcasting code. And I'll put a link to some videos that I've created that go through the broadcasting code in more detail. But it's essentially a code that all program makers are required to work with in mind in order to make sure that their programs are fair, that they don't cause unnecessarily harm, and that they are balanced, and that they're suited for public discussion. Radio is then also tied with the legislation which is more broadly in terms of media legislation. So the general law of the land, the libel and slander, contempt of court, but rules around political impartiality, the advertising standard regulations, and then any station rules that an individual station may wish to add to the minimum requirements that are legislated through Ofcom. The Community Radio Toolkit remains a good source of starting point for engagement with these requirements. Some of them are very simple and rule of thumb requirements. Doesn't necessarily need any specialist knowledge, but it depends on the nature of the content that you're seeking to produce. And if there's somebody in the organisation who has some experience of this, always defer to somebody else's their expertise, but while keeping yourself informed of what is actually in the legislation and what is actually relevant practice. So community radio, UNESCO, kind of, if we think about it in terms of this framework, we're thinking about it in terms of the opportunity for people to get involved. I think that's the core difference with community radio. While community broadcast, mainstream broadcast media is about providing services for people, community radio is much more about people being involved and being motivated about giving something back or participating in the development of a community, your own community that you identify with. So it's something that it's participative, and it's something that you need access to the resources and the facilities to do it. And that raises a question: is it about audiences or is it about communities? And the BBC largely works on an audience development model, which sees audiences as a kind of I'm trying to find the right, I was going to use the word blob, but that's the wrong word, as an en masse. And that you look at particular characteristics within that audience, and you play out how you can adjust your programming to meet what those expectations are. This is a model in which media is done for those audiences. And what your job is as a producer and as a developer of content and services for somebody like the BBC is to keep on track of those trends and how they're moving along. But that doesn't imply that there's any kind of sense of participation from, or much sense of participation from the people who are listening themselves. And so community radio and community media follows a more community development model, so that it's not something which is done for people. I mean, you've got to ask yourself, your starting point is to ask yourself the question, what is a community in the first place? And how do we imagine what our community is? And how do we build up a picture of our community? Well, why should we wait for market researchers in London to define what our sense of community is and what our community needs are? We have a right and to self-representation and to define what it is that we see as our sense of collective community representation should be. So radio is a really important mechanism of building a sense of community through its own practice. So it brings people together who might not have a strong, we live in an age where many people don't have a strong sense of community. They don't have a sense of strong identification because we live lives which are fractured and disparate. We'll talk about this in more detail in future talks. And often the kind of type of engagement that's put in place is often tokenistic, or it's often it reduces people to kind of manipulate people in a kind of way that kind of just treats them as unable to define things for themselves and look after themselves. But what we really want to be aiming for is that there's a sense of citizens' power in the model that we're working on. So this developmental community development model sits at the heart of expectations about participation in community media and through community media. We are community builders, community media makers with the aim of building and supporting and nurturing community. And we do this through things like community conversations. So the idea of engaging with stories. This is what I mean. It doesn't have to be that kind of model which is about purely presentation, 3 minutes here, 5 minutes there, bring a guest in every now and again to have a laugh and a joke with. that's not what this is about. This is about, extending and exploring the lost voices that we never hear, or we seldom hear, being relayed as part of our ordinary everyday set of conversations, so that these become the habits and the routine that we listen to. We listen to one another. So draw it to a close at this point, because I'm sure I've gone on plenty long enough. I got drawn into this because there's so many facets to it, and I had to rewrite it, and I'm sure I could edit and improve the flow of this. But I think, it's a YouTube presentation. You can press pause. However, any feedback that you've got for me to follow up on this would be appreciated. But I think what I'll be doing in future episodes of these talks is going into some of these things in a bit more detail, and I'll keep coming back to them, because each one of them has a different world that you can explore in its own right, and we need to work through this. So a couple of questions to leave you with is, kind of, what community radio stations do you listen to? Do you listen to any? Are you aware of what community radio stations are in your area? Can you find some online that you might listen to? And what defines it as a community radio station? What do you think people identify with in that community radio station? And to what extent do you think professionalism means in practice in a community radio station? What does it mean? Is professionalism a barrier to access and engagement? And if you were going to make a program, what kind of program would you want to produce? It's relevant that we don't just talk about this in theory and abstractly, but that we actually have a go at engaging with people and putting forward a model of engagement and reciprocal, mutual conversation that actually enhances our understanding of who we are and what works, and who other people are and what works for them as well. So lots of links to up on the document. I'll stop the share. And I'm now going to have a cup of tea. If you've got any comments, as I say, email me at robwatson@decentered.co.uk, or leave a comment in the forum, which is forum.decentered.co.uk, or in the MOOC, which is mooc.decentered.co.uk. But I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunity to raise questions and issues, and thank you for listening. It's been a long session. Should have had a break halfway through, but we'll do that next time. So thank you for watching. Stay safe and don't stress. You've been watching a Decentered Media talk with me, Rob Watson. To find out more, go to decentered.co.uk or follow on Twitter and Instagram @Decentered Media.